Good morning and welcome, and thank you for joining me for another week of our daily devotionals as we make our way through the book of Proverbs. We're in chapter 10. We're going to pick up our reading today in verse 8. And so let's begin by reading this passage, and then I will offer some perspective or commentary on it. Solomon says, "The wise in heart accepts commands, but a chattering fool comes to ruin." Now, this may seem really relatively obvious, but really what he's talking about is the difference between having a focused and an unfocused life. There's an old saying that if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. And I find that a lot of people find themselves in that kind of a quandary because their life is not unfolding the way they had hoped it would unfold, but they don't understand why that's the case, because in their mind, I've done all the things that I'm supposed to do. And that's the problem. If you have the wrong target, or as Jesus put it, he said, "The light that's in you is darkness. How great is that darkness?" So that if you have the wrong objective, if you're building your house upon a foundation of sand, you're going to find that the results are always going to be disappointing. It doesn't matter how beautiful, extravagant, tall, and big the structure is that you build out of your life. In other words, it doesn't matter how far or high you go. At some point, if the foundation is upon something less than God himself, it's always going to collapse. It's just a matter of waiting for the right conditions to come along, and everything will be wiped out. And so the wise man is the one who accepts the commands of God, is what's being implied here. They're not just somebody who's obedient to anybody who's over them, although that's not necessarily a bad trait. But the idea is that they're really looking to hear what God has to say, what his word has to say, and they like to bring their life into agreement with what the word of God says, and they're obedient to that. And you'll find generally that will mean that you're to respect and honor those who are in positions of authority over you, unless, of course, they instruct or command or demand that you do something that is contrary to what the Word of God says. So that's the idea, that wisdom is really proven by the choices and decisions we make, because a wise man makes choices and decisions that may not be immediately beneficial or evident to everybody as beneficial, but they're the things that will prove themselves out over the long term. Where he says a chattering fool basically will come to ruin. Now, what is a chattering fool? In some ways, it's someone who is in love with the sound of their own voice. In other words, they're more concerned with being heard than they are saying anything of worth and listening to things that are important. And that's why there are some people that I've talked to, I've met and encountered over the years, who basically just want to kind of tell me everything that's going through their mind and what they're thinking and what they're feeling, but they never really are interested in what you have to say. And even when they come and ask you questions, they keep on talking over or going against or arguing against and basically chattering. And that person is going to find themselves ending up to being in the place that they don't want to be in, because it's all about trying to control the narrative rather than just discovering what the truth is. Now, we live in a cultural time where the idea of controlling the narrative is really the main objective. I think about the divisions that are going in the political setting in our country today, where I find that one group of people, they call themselves progressive, but they're very regressive in how they're approaching life, because they're so antithetical to the current regime that whatever the regime is for, they're against, even if what they're for is a good thing. And so it takes on a level of nonsensicalness. But yet, when they get up in front of a group, they just talk and talk and talk. And if people aren't listening to them, they start raising their voice and yelling even louder. And basically, when we encounter people like that in our life, whether it's in the political arena or the relational arena or whatever arena you're in, somebody who just simply shouts and yells and raises their voice above you, the best thing you can do is step back and remove yourself from the situation. Because Jesus put it very simply. He says, if you cast your pearl before swine, they'll just trample them underneath. In other words, they don't see value in what you're saying or what you're doing, or how or why you're doing what you're doing. They just simply want to be in control of whatever's being done. And so a pig basically will rush to get something that he thinks will satisfy it, and will, in an effort to get a rotten piece of bread, it will go and trample the most precious jewels that are under its feet and never realize what it's done. You see, we always have this concept that, well, sooner or later they'll figure out how foolish they have been. My experience is there are many foolish people who never learn about their folly. They never change, because for them to change, they have to admit that they were wrong. And they spend all of their time and their energy trying to convince you how right they are, how wrong you are, how good they are, how bad you are. I mean, that's all they do, is just keep on going on and on and on. Now, we give it clinical classifications. We call it narcissistic personality disorder, or behavioral personality disorder, or sociopathic personality, or a psychopath. We have all these names that we give them, which may have some clinical worth or value as far as creating categories of understanding. But the bottom line is, these are people who are so in love with themselves and their own concepts that they just simply want to dominate the conversation. And I have found that it's worthless to engage in conversation with them, that nothing ever changes, that they never will do the one thing that's essential for a meaningful relationship, and that's to be able to say, "I'm sorry, I was wrong, please forgive me." Those words, if they can never say those words. "I'm sorry, I was wrong, please forgive me." And because they can't utter those words, and they just do everything in the world to get you to say those words, even though it's not true in your case, you find yourself incapable of having a meaningful conversation. So what they are is they're chattering fools. It's so important to be able to listen to criticism when it's delivered, and not always accept the criticism as being valid, but to at least give it consideration. Because one of the things I've learned is sometimes people criticize you for something just because they don't like it, or it offends them or impacts them negatively, and yet you may be, in fact, speaking the truth into their life. And so you need to listen to criticism, but you don't necessarily need to accept it until you've evaluated it to see whether it's good or bad. Because people who are chattering fools, if you will, are always on the search for people with these kind of codependent personalities that allow themselves to be browbeat into submission, because ultimately they want to control the narrative so that they're in power and you're submissive to them. And they're not seeking to enrich you, they're seeking to tear you down. And so as a result, you can't get a word in edgewise. And if you do, it's always turned around. I remember one individual who was so clever at this, because no matter what you said to him, he would turn around and say, "So what you're saying is," and he would say something that you had not said and you were not intending to say. But he kept on doing that over and over again. And you realize at some point, he's not attempting to come to kind of a resolution. This is not about building relationship. This is about winning and putting themselves in the position of supremacy. Is it surprising that that person has found themselves without relationships, without friendships, without family, that people don't really want to hang out with them? And it's not surprising, but they've created this dynamic, and yet try to talk to them and explain that to them, and it doesn't do any good. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't make a difference. They just keep on circling the same wagon over and over and over again. It doesn't change until that person can come to you and say, "You know what? I'm sorry. I was wrong. Would you please forgive me?" That's where we find the example of the prodigal son in Luke 15. Remember, he leaves his father's. He's very angry with his brother, his father's family, and maybe he had some degree of justification in that. I'm sure that his parents and his brother hadn't been the nicest people all the time, but nonetheless, he'd become overcome by bitterness and resentment, and suddenly he finds himself with nothing and no one. He's completely bereft of funds and friends. And then all of a sudden, he comes to his senses, it says. He suddenly looks at himself for the first time and says, "Even the slaves in my father's house have a better life than I have." And he says, "I'm going to go back to my father and I'm going to say these things. I've sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you." And before he could even get those words out, his father was there to embrace him, because his father knew for him to turn and come back was an evidence that he had a change of heart. So many times relationships cannot change until there is a change of heart. And I think you need to ask yourself, if you find yourself estranged with people in your life you love, you have to begin by asking the question, is it me? Am I the one who's guilty of really being the chattering fool? And you may, and if you do, you have to say, you need to go to that person and say, I'm sorry, I've sinned against you, I ask you to forgive me. I was wrong. But you may look at it and say, no, I'm not the chattering fool. I'm not perfect. I don't handle everything right all the time. But they're a chattering fool. They will never take ownership for their bad choices and bad behavior. And when they come to that, when you come to that realization, that's the beginning. That's how you start helping them. Because until you draw a line and say, I'm not going to live in your folly. Until you draw that line and say, I'm not going to live within your folly. I'm not going to live within your distorted narrative. They will have nothing that stops them. And they will just continue to take advantage of you. So you need to stop and say, no, I'm not having this conversation until you're willing to come back and say, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Would you please forgive me? It may sound hardcore to some of you, but you have to realize that that's tough love. But it's love, but it's tough because these people only respond to tough love, if at all. And if they don't, we'll find they'll just walk away from your life. And that'll be the end of the conversation. Well, anyway, some tough stuff here today. Didn't mean to go there, but there we are. Okay, we'll continue tomorrow as we look at verse 9 of chapter 10. Blessings.